The Gwart Show is sponsored by Ellipsis Labs. Ellipsis Labs is building a world where mainstream finance happens on-chain. Their first product, Phoenix, is a fully on-chain limit order book DEX on Solana doing hundreds of millions of dollars in volume. I know this team personally. It's one of the strongest in the space. If you're interested in working with a team that's here to stay, Ellipsis Labs is hiring engineers passionate about DeFi to join their team. You can find Ellipsis Labs on Twitter at ellipsis_labs or head to ellipsislabs.xyz to learn more and apply.
Hey guys, today we have on Elijah, DeFi thought leader, also his first ever podcast. Somebody who I've talked with a good bit on Twitter and thought, you know what, we should do a podcast together. So Elijah, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us what you do and sort of like where you work in crypto.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously I'm Elijah, I'm working on Neutron. We are pioneering this approach to DeFi, which involves making our block space more opinionated, which just basically means like enshrining key infrastructure, such as like oracles, bridging protocols, that allow us to like do what we want to do more effectively. I do a little mechanism design, mostly product work nowadays though, as well as like a ton of BD, and ship posts on Twitter when I have the time.
Nice. Okay. So wait, let's go back a little bit. I know you worked with Max on multiple concurrent proposers. I think you said that it wasn't really that at the time, but can you just like tell us a little bit about the inception of that idea and like where, I don't know, conclusions you guys came to and like how that kind of came about?
Yeah. So Max and I have actually known each other for a pretty decent time now. He was actually the one who got me into crypto. I got an email. We were in the same minor program in college, and I got an email at some point. And I was at the time working as like a research assistant, not making that much money. And I kind of saw crypto as like this thing that I was always passively interested in, but like never took the leap into thinking it could be like a serious job. And Max was working on like a few research problems at the time. Like the key insight we were building off of was this idea that like you could see a DEX as a graph. Where like the tokens are nodes and then the edges between them are the different like AMMs. And there's like all this really rich literature about graph optimization algorithms. And so once you like start applying this literature, to this representation of like DEX as a graph, you can get these nice results for, problems like optimal routing or optimal liquidity incentive optimization. So that was kind of like our start. Now that's like a little bit more popular knowledge, like the, Alex Evans, Guillermo, and Tarun have like worked on a paper that kind of uses that to like solve optimal routing problems. By the time it was like somewhat alpha. So we did a bunch of work around there, did some like consulting and product work for a few different DEXs. At some point I got in touch with the Bain Capital crypto guys. Where we started working on a bunch of different ideas around decentralized exchange design, mostly focused around this like line of research called replicating market makers, which was this idea that you could provide liquidity to an AMM and that liquidity position could replicate all of these different payoffs. And so there's like a few different companies at the time working on this. There was like Primitive, there was Composable, and then we were going to build this like layer that all of these different RMM teams that were going to be built would then compile their RMMs and like deploy them on top of this DEX, at the time we were going to call it Duality. And pretty like quickly, we realized that the derivative structure just doesn't really work. Like, I mean, for kind of two fundamental reasons. Like one, because like the profitability of the AMM positions was tied to how many people are actually using them to trade, how many fees are accruing, and not enough fees were accruing for them to like justify the payoff or like replicate these different derivatives that would be desired. And then the other thing is that like, people really want options for leverage, and a lot of these instruments were like covered positions. But we kind of saw this like first problem as like something that was like really, really solvable. And we didn't really know how to solve it. And so I got in touch with Max. I was like, hey, we have this thing. There are these AMMs that, we're kind of basing this whole product around, that they just don't really work. Let's brainstorm some ideas for how we can make them work. And yeah, that kind of led us down to like 2 years of researching censorship resistance and how to run on-chain auctions. And yeah, at some point we linked up with Malesh and wrote that paper about multiple concurrent proposers.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. And so then now, what are you working on now? So I guess like Duality is not the name of your company anymore. What have you transitioned to?
Yeah, so we ended up getting acqui-hired by the Neutron team. So the things that I'm like mostly working on is, our belief is like there's like a lot of innovation left to be seen in DeFi. A lot of those 10x innovations left, though, deal with not looking at like how all these applications exist in isolation, but how they exist when they integrate with one another. And so like, one framing for this that I found pretty useful is like, I sort of start from this belief that most of crypto is going to be DeFi. Like crypto was built for DeFi, like Bitcoin was for like decentralized payments. So like most of crypto is DeFi, and most of DeFi is like kind of three different applications or products or three categories maybe. One is yield, another is exchange, and then a third is leverage. And all of these kind of need each other. So, if you look at like how credit protocols, set their parameters, a lot of it deals with how much liquidity is there on chain in order to safely route liquidations into USDC. So if there's like some risky asset that's being used as collateral, in order for like the lending protocol to remain solvent, it needs to trust that liquidators are going to be able to, take that collateral and then sell it for USDC and not incur a loss. So that deals with like how much liquidity is on chain. And then, from yields, like, obviously you can have like unsustainable, Ponzi yields or incentives or things like this. But for like sustainable yields, a lot of this comes from trading activity, whether that be like, perps trading or spot trading. And so, in this way, like, yield needs leverage trading and spot trading. And then like, yield also needs these things because, people are entering and exiting positions. So they need to like trade in and out. And they need like spot liquidity in order to do that. So like all these different things, are heavily reliant on each other, but a lot of the product innovations that have existed so far have kind of like innovated in isolation for each of these. So yeah, we spent a lot of time like thinking about how these different pieces fit together and actually like building out solutions for this. I think like the two examples I'm most excited about right now are so Mars protocol, which is a credit protocol, is going to launch any asset as collateral perps on Neutron, I think next week or 2 weeks from now. And in order to like have any asset as collateral for perps, you need like sufficient spot liquidity. And specifically, you need sufficient spot liquidity that has depth above whatever like the liquidation bounty is. So like, let's say like, a liquidator is receiving like a 5% bonus on like the liquidation. Ideally you want liquidity that's like, within, minus 5% slippage from the mid price in order to support that liquidation. So instead of like having some like, AMM vault or trading strategy or like liquidity vault that optimizes for, some other metric, like a lot of the vaults that we're building are actually optimizing for supplying liquidity above like this like liquidation threshold or above this like 5% depth, so we can like juice as much as we can out of the supply caps and boost them safely to ensure more capacity. And then generally like the advantage of having any asset as collateral, which obviously like my point before was that it needs spot liquidity co-located with it on chain. The kind of core benefit is like DYDX, HyperLiquidX currently use USDC as collateral. And so if you want to like do the most popular trade on chain or the most, one of the more popular perps trades, which is basis trading, you want to hold spot and then short it. But if you want to do this on HyperLiquidX or DYDX currently, you need to hold USDC, then you need to hold, some other asset that you want to be shorting, and then you need to short it, right? So you need twice the capital because you need to hold the USDC, you need to hold that, the spot asset that you want to short, and then you need to short it. Whereas if you could use that asset as collateral directly, you could just short it. So yeah, just thinking a lot about how these components fit together, and like building optimizations around that. And yeah, those were just two examples that's kind of like come to the top of my mind.
What do you think has been the reason for like Hyperliquid's outsized success? Or at least if you look at crypto Twitter, it seems like Hyperliquid has had tremendous success thus far, and people seem very excited about what they're doing. Like what has been that like unlock for them?
Yeah, I think it might come down to like three things. I think one is like, at least from the outside perspective, and I obviously can't validate this 100%, but, what it seems like is DYDX spent a lot of time building an entirely new blockchain. And in that time, they just could not spend as much time innovating on product. So I think that's part of the reason where, like instead of working towards, solving users' needs, you spend a lot of time on like solving infrastructure problems. And maybe in the long run, that's the right decision. But certainly like within this time window, it's allowed like other people to come in, innovate on product. I think like HyperLiquidX also, is just running a really well done incentive campaign. And I think that's clearly like a driver of success. And then like, obviously the third one is innovation on product. And that's like, HLP vaults are incredibly popular. And then I think like pre-market perps, I believe they have, is like, it's kind of this like scalable way to onboard new users. What do I mean by this? I kind of mean like, the ideal situation to be in as like a application or a chain is that you kind of like have this constant inflow of like new things for people to do. So Solana has really taken off on the back of meme coins, which is like this like very low marginal cost, like high impact product, which is like onboarding tons of users in the sense that like it costs nothing for, to Solana to like launch a new meme coin, for someone to launch a new meme coin on Solana. But like, they happen every day. And like, there's some guy with a TikTok account, like convincing people to come on chain and use it. A lot of chains onboard users with like new product launches or token launches, but like, bringing a DeFi protocol on your chain or like finding a great team and like, fostering their growth is like this really, really expensive, like long-term play. And I think like perps markets, like pre-market perps actually look a little bit more like the meme coin type situation where it's like HyperLiquidX doesn't need to do any work in like getting a great DeFi team or a great protocol to like launch their product or token on their chain. They just need someone somewhere to launch a token that people want to speculate on before it's live. And so it's kind of like this low marginal cost, like, but like high output way to onboard new users. Like it's giving people a new reason to come on board.
Yeah. Okay. So I know you mentioned the idea of opinionated block space, and I also don't know if you want this to lead into your decision to build on Cosmos, but can you talk to us maybe a little bit about what that means to you, and then like maybe why you chose to build where you did, and like why you did.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think like going back to this like MCP, like the multiple concurrent proposer story. Like originally we were trying to solve all of these things in smart contracts. And like we quickly realized like, you can't solve these issues at the app layer. There's just like problems with our infrastructure. And, you can kind of like trace it back to like Bitcoin, right? Like Satoshi's not really thinking about how to run like, low latency censorship resistant auctions or something. He's thinking about distributed payments. And what you want for like an auction or for like a market is not necessarily what you want for payments. And so Ethereum uses like a similar consensus design to Bitcoin in the sense that like it's also leader based. And when you have like a leader based consensus algorithm, you have this leader who has this like brief monopoly while they're proposing the block over what transactions are included and how they're ordered. And so, at least for the example of like MCP or like censorship resistance, what we learned was like you kind of can't solve like these problems of like building really great market designs or great auctions without first going to the consensus layer. And that's kind of what like drove us outside of Ethereum was, okay, we need to solve these problems. Where do we solve it? And at the time, I think like it was like less in vogue to launch like a centralized sequencer and have a OP stack was like barely a thing at the time, and Cosmos was kind of like this blank slate blockchain development kit that we thought could get us to that vision much quicker. I think like what we've discovered though is there's a lot of other things that can benefit from like opinionated design decisions. One that I'm like particularly excited about is like oracles. So, right now, if you want to use an oracle on like a generalized smart contract platform, there's like some third party provider that you need to trust, that you need to like query. And there's like some latency between when you query it and when it comes on chain. It can be expensive to do. And between the time that you query and it comes on chain, there can either be like value that's extractable Or like, it could just be like inefficient as a result. Like, maybe you want your transactions to wait until like there's a fresh Oracle price. So now you're like adding additional latency to the user or something. So like one thing we've done is we've actually enshrined our Oracle as part of consensus. So we've made like this opinionated decision that, in order for DeFi to be better, we need like, really, really fresh Oracle prices. There needs to be an Oracle price on chain every block. Because like, oracles are critical to DeFi, right? They're used in perps protocols. They're used sometimes in like spot market making vaults. They're used in, lend borrow protocols. And so like, given their importance and like centrality to building really great DeFi, we went ahead and like enshrined, an oracle as part of consensus. So like, along with their votes in every block on like whether the block is valid or not, validators on Neutron also submit price feeds from centralized exchanges. And so like this ensures that there's a new oracle price every block, and like it reduces, the latency, and just improves like the overall efficiency of the system. And like, now you can start building a lot cooler stuff when you can start trusting the oracle more, because there's this problem of like adverse selection, for example, in like AMMs, which is basically this idea that the AMM price lags behind the centralized exchange price. And so like, there's these arbitrageurs that can come in, take a trade at the centralized exchange price, and take a trade on the, on-chain exchange price, and they could like make the difference because like the on-chain exchange price will lag behind the centralized exchange price. But no, now imagine that you have like, a fresh centralized exchange price coming onto your blockchain every block. There's no more arbitrage to take because, the trades that are being offered on chain are the same trades that are being offered off chain. So this is like how it could be applied to spot exchange, but like any Oracle based perps as well could benefit. Any lend borrow protocol or anything else that uses an Oracle can benefit as well. So, that's just like an example of like opinionated block space. And you can't really do these things unless you are allowed to make opinionated decisions about, how consensus interacts with the virtual machine.
Thanks for listening to The Gwart Show on the Blockspace Podcast Network. Subscribe to our newsletter at blockspace.media to get the show directly to your inbox. Show links, transcripts, and Bitcoin articles twice per week. Stay ahead of the conversation by visiting blockspace.media.
Yeah, okay. I've seen like some pushback on MCP, and considering you were, well, I would say part of the genesis of it, what do you think are the legitimate sort of concerns about MCP thus far? I've seen like, what is it? Like when you merge these blocks, like there's somebody who gets like last look or whatever. Like, I don't know. I just listening to Max, right? Like, what do you think are some of the, pushback, and like, where do you think is legitimate in terms of like a large change of like consensus protocol, like Ethereum, versus where do you think that like maybe some of these thoughts are overblown?
Yeah, I think the most legitimate opinion is just like a lack of clarity on what these systems look like in production. I think some of this is like more of like a ideological difference, though. If you talk to like Toli or you look in Cosmos or something like this, like you get these chains that are much more willing to be wrong and like ship something, learn about like its properties in the real world, and iterate on that. And if you kind of look in the Ethereum community, you kind of get this much more rigorous research-oriented approach before something can actually be published. So I think like a lot of the most legitimate, pushback comes from the fact that, hey, this is just not our engineering culture in Ethereum. There's definitely like a few different directions that, I think people who are trying to implement MCP-like constructions are going down. One has like what is sometimes called like a view canonicalizer, which is like there's someone responsible for like collecting all of the different views of the block from all of the different proposers, and then like unioning them together. And like, this is usually easier to implement, like it's much more predictable in terms of like the behavior that different agents might exhibit. But you're kind of giving this person who's like unioning all of these blocks, not infinite degrees of freedom, but like, enough degrees of freedom for them to maybe like insert transactions at the last second, which, does make a meaningful difference, in an environment where there's like sufficient activity. And then there's kind of like this other line of research, which like looks more like Braid and what Max is working on, which is how can we get all of these different proposers to simultaneously release their blocks and have no single view canonicalizer. Like there's no single party that says, okay, we're going to take these blocks and at this time and in doing that, there's no single party that has like that last look or that latency advantage. I personally feel like pretty optimistic that it's a solvable problem, like doing it without a view canonicalizer. And I think like maybe one of the less legitimate criticisms is like, oh, like we don't know what's going to happen, in the sense that like there's going to be all these timing games and this is just never going to work. Because like part of me thinks that like, the goal or like the objective function is not necessarily to build a perfect system. It's to build a system that's at least better than what exists today. Like I think what exists today is pretty crap. Like I think it's pretty clear that it's pretty crap. Like there's just like all these things that you would want to do that are like super useful that you just can't do on chain. And a lot of those things like are not solved in a really nice way with a view canonicalizer. So I think like if you can get a solution that maybe isn't perfect, maybe has some timing games, maybe prices some people out of staking, but gets you like 90% of the way there. If it's an improvement, like it's an improvement, and I think it should be taken seriously. But I guess like in the context of Ethereum, there's like a broader discussion about, what are their goals and, are they willing to price out certain participants? And, that's a little bit distinct from, the decision to do MCP. It's related, of course, because the decision to do MCP or not might be downstream of that. But yeah, it's like a sort of like cultural decision that they need to make.
What do you think that Ethereum's goals should be? Not just letting you go, like complete personal opinion.
Yeah. What do you think? I'll let you go first.
People have heard my opinions are not particularly profound. I zoom much more out than I think you mechanism designers do. Like, for example, when I had Max on, and I talked to him a good bit, but like when I had Max on, I asked him, okay, so like, let's say you get MCP and you can improve censorship resistance of the chain and, improve like how AMMs and block builders, so on and so forth, how they all function. I'm like, okay, so what's the end game? Like, what are we trading on chain that makes a difference? And Max's response is, well, we can have dollar, stablecoin markets be the most efficient in the world. And, it's like, this is one of these things where I think people get so caught up in the minutia of it. And I'm like, I don't personally think it matters that much, the level of censorship resistance necessary for trading around a bunch of stable coins, especially because people seem to have a strong predilection for centralized stable coins. So versus decentralized stable coins, which we can touch on in a bit. But like all this stuff to me is just like, dude, it doesn't like, who cares? But anyways, like that's my point is just like, I really don't even know like what we're trying to do here. So a lot of my opinions are kind of irrelevant. Like I'm so like, I'm like the opposite of missing the forest for the trees. Like all I see are the trees. And like at some point it's like the treetops are useless. Like I'm just going to wait and see, and heckle from the sidelines. But I guess like that, maybe that's why I'm curious, like your opinion, like where does DeFi have this massive advantage that like really makes a huge difference? Because like I just don't see trading around like really like low. Like we can reduce stablecoin spreads to like 2 bips. It's like, dude, who cares? There's stable coins. Like who gives a shit? Like, but of course, my opinion doesn't matter. But so I am curious. Like now I'm going to be serious. Like I am curious, like to hear what your thoughts are in terms of where we're going. Maybe.
First off, I think your opinions do matter. So there's that.
Well, thank you.
There's that, and then I guess my perspective is like I kind of see like two states of DeFi, or like two ways that DeFi wins. I think like there's the first, which is kind of like what seems more in line with your view of the world, which is like there's this new asset class, right? That like blockchains create, and these assets clearly have demand, right? They have properties that people want. And like, for these assets that, have these properties that people want, they'll want to do, they'll be willing to like take a cut, off of their, maybe the efficiency, in order to like trade them, transact with them, leverage on them in a way that is like most native, to where the tokens are actually issued. And this could be because like maybe there's more liquidity on chain in the early days before there's like a SEX listing or something like that. Or this could just be because like people really want self-custody. Or it could be like for other ideological reasons that I have no idea about. Maybe it's like just the user experience of being able to like freely use your tokens however you want, like composably in like, whatever protocols you want to use them in. So that's kind of like the first view is like, there's this desirable asset class. This asset class is going to keep growing. People will want to use this asset class in ways that is most native to the asset class for like a variety of reasons. I think like DeFi will do pretty well in that world, but just like maybe not amazing. I think the other view of the world, which is, the one that I'm personally more excited about and I would love to see come to fruition, which is that DeFi is like a better way to build FinTech. Like, and this is kind of like maybe put as like the credible compute view of the world, where there's like, all this misalignment in finance, and this misalignment, like, drives rent seeking, it drives people to sometimes cheat on the rules. And, if we could build these systems in a credible way, and like approach them in efficiency and the limit, then, it's going to be a no-brainer for people to like, move what they're doing on chain. So I kind of see like those, two worlds, even coexisting in some way. And I think if like your goal is maybe to prioritize like, this like pursuit of being money, I think you can probably get away with option one. But I think if like your goal is like, I want to build, like a better financial system, that people can trust more, that people can, have greater control over, that like, in having more trust, it makes the system more efficient. Like there's like this example that, Tarun put out a good thread the other day, that like I quote tweeted, and like, is this idea of like having these like verifiable, collateral agreements is actually this like superpower that TradFi doesn't have. And like, my quote tweet was basically about how, there's a lot of research that says, the 2008 crash was actually less due to the fact that there's all of these like really shitty derivatives that were oversold, and actually more due to the fact that when, crunch time came, no one was able to discern which derivatives were the really shitty ones and which ones weren't as shitty. And, like they couldn't, figure out like, who had what on their balance sheets, and that chaos, that like cost to revealing the information about the quality of collateral, about how people were using the collateral, about like, how much this collateral was rehypothecated or being leveraged, was just unavailable. And this caused panic because people were just like, I'm not going to pay the cost to reveal all this information in a timely manner. So, I'm better off just like assuming the worst case, dumping my assets. And that was like a large part of what led to the crash. And like, there's like, one of the big pieces of evidence that supports this is like the performance of like subprime bonds was actually not that bad in retrospect. But like, obviously the impact to the global financial market was horrible. And so, so I think there's this world where like, this like more verifiable, credible system. And when I say credible, I mean like you can trust that, the exchange that you're delegating, your transactions to is like properly representing them. I think like this is like a really, really interesting value proposition for crypto to try to tackle. I think it requires like these things like multiple concurrent proposers for the purpose of censorship. It requires like really, really low latencies. It requires sacrificing, like solo stakers potentially, or like at least like solo stakers as we know it today, in terms of like as low, hardware requirements as they have on Ethereum. And I think like, I guess going back to the original question, what's your view for Ethereum? I guess I don't really have a ton of hope that, mainnet is ever going to do those things. So I would kind of like abandon that if I were Ethereum. And I would probably focus on ETH as money, and like fixing the communications around like, why ETH moving to L2s is going to be this great thing for like Ethereum, the asset. Maybe even like the EF funding some like more aligned L2s or something of this nature. But yeah, I think like they're kind of too far gone to compete on this like, at least the L1 is too far gone to compete on this like credible compute, better version of finance vision. And so like, given that, probably makes sense to focus on other things.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's why I honestly think like Max's whole endeavor is like kind of futile. I mean, I think he's headed in the right direction. Like, obviously, he's headed in the right direction. And I think that also, his most recent proposal just reduced the block times from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. I don't know if that was exactly him, but like he was obviously the motivation for that. Like, you're headed in the right direction. But who cares? makes a very minimal amount of difference. And so I generally feel the same way. I wanted to go back to something you said though. You said that for this like more, credible compute aspect of FinTech, also a side note, I would just like to say, I tend to agree that we're probably making closer to like incremental improvements to FinTech versus cypherpunk ethos, but that's just a personal opinion. But I do see, I guess what I'm saying is I see what you're saying there. But why would something like that require MCP? Like, I'm just curious, like what your rationale there is, like, why does that require censorship resistance, for example, to have like a higher level of like confidence in how a decentralized financial system would work?
Yeah, I mean, it might not need like MCP very specifically in like the way that like Braid works or something like this, but it needs like censorship resistance at low latencies as a property, generally speaking. So like, let's just take like, well, for I guess the starting place is like, I kind of started from this position that all these different components are related to each other and rely on each other, right? And like maybe one of the simplest, mechanisms other than just like simple payments is exchange, right? Like being able to trade like one asset for another asset. Let's say you like want to realize this vision in a way that like is aligned with like, okay, we can do this thing more credibly, right? Where like Robinhood can't just turn off the buy switch when, like the market makers are going underwater or something like that. And if you want to do that, and you want to move it into this credible setting where like anyone can verify that like the compute was done properly and that the rules are immutable, or at least like the way that the rules can change are like very transparent. If you want to do that in this sort of like credible compute way, you just can't do it without censorship resistance. And this goes back to like the original on-chain auctions paper, where we kind of like, we looked at auctions, but if we take the exchange story, right? Let's say like, you're a market maker, right? In order to like properly manage your inventory, you probably want to be quoting and canceling orders every block, right? Like you don't want if you're offering like a buy order at some price and then all of a sudden, that price becomes completely stale, there's some massive move on the centralized exchange and like that price is like no longer valid. It's now like a losing trade. You want to be able to cancel that before other people can trade against it. And the problem is like, if you go and cancel that, you're not making money on any, on that cancel, right? Like you're just not losing money, right? Whereas like someone else is making a lot of money, right? Someone else can come in and like, pay the difference between, the price on that trade and, the price on Binance. And, they can take whatever is left over and make money on that trade. And so basically, if you want to like make sure that your cancels are like getting, executed before people can like trade against you, you need like censorship resistant guarantees. Because you need to get guarantees that, there's not someone who can come in and like front run you and be able to say, hey, no, like, I'm able to make money on your stale order. And you're just hoping that you won't lose money or lose that much money, lose whatever you're paying in the fees to like cancel the actual order, and in the priority fees to like be able to come first. And so, yeah, I guess like this example is like not just censorship resistance. It's like censorship resistance plus like verifiable ordering rules, which is
but that's like a little bit my point. Not that to say it's a good point, but I'm just saying this is a little bit my point. Like I think what you're describing can be done on a centralized sequencer too, right? Like and like Hyperliguid can show like verify these rules are out there and in place. But I guess maybe when I think censorship resistance is a little bit different than how you describe censorship resistance. I guess maybe that would be the point that I was going to make. Like I don't know that like a distributed value percent has much impact on this aspect, right? Like as long as you're verifying that, like for example, you can't be front run or whatever it may be. Well, it could be a single box doing this as well, right?
Yeah, I think though that this kind of devolves pretty quickly. So like take your example with a centralized sequencer, right? Like so there's this really great framing of, okay, so a blockchain can verifiably compute any function you give it, right? It can credibly compute any function on a given set of inputs, right? But how those inputs actually get into the blockchain is this like exercise left up to the reader, and it actually matters a lot. So your point was like, okay, we can verify that you can't get front run, right? But if you let's say you send this cancel order to a centralized sequencer, Well, what you can't verify is that like the centralized sequencer received the input in time, right? So the centralized sequencer could like have plausible deniability and say, hey, I actually never received your cancel order in time. I received these like, these arbitrager transactions before I received your cancel order. And so, I delayed your transaction like 2 blocks, and it didn't matter at that time because, these arbitrageurs already sniped your order. So you're right that you get verifiable ordering rules from just like a centralized sequencer. Like people can like retroactively say, oh, like this sequence was done properly, but you can't verify that like the centralized sequencer is actually including all the different transactions when they're actually received, because, receiving the transaction is this like unverifiable, like non-deterministic process.
So what do you think the future of AMMs is? It's just complete left field, but I just wanted to no thinking time, have to respond. What is the future of AMMs? Like, where do you see AMMs being very useful?
Yeah, I kind of see 2 worlds. I see one world where it's like, AMMs are just like this, like, this like thing of the past. AMMs were like built to support, like trading on chain in a way that was like computationally efficient, right? Like the main innovation in Uniswap was arguably that like, you can get the output on an input in like, O of 1 time, in constant time, rather than like, oh, these were like some game changing, market making, or like market design, solution. It's just like, okay, it was just efficient to create a market on chain for like long tail assets. And, as we like reduce latencies, like order books will become superior because, on-chain order books will be able to onboard market makers and compete with centralized exchange efficiency. So that's like one sort of direction that things can go in. I think like the way that AMMs will survive, however, will kind of look a little different than they are today. I think like one way for them to survive is just like giving them informational advantages. So I think like one way to do this is like, okay, so maybe you take the perspective that we actually don't want, we want to keep as much value going to retail users as possible, or like, we want all of this value that's created from market making, to be funneled into, anyone who wants to, right? We don't want to just democratize the access to market making. We want to also democratize the rewards of market making. Well, I think you can do this with like some different Oracle designs. So I think like one way is like, I talked about like how, Neutron has this enshrined Oracle. So like one way to do this is, you can finalize the transactions before you actually finalize the execution. So you find, people submit transactions, you queue those transactions. You then have like this AMM that, these transactions are getting ready to be executed against. And there's some delay between when these transactions are like included and guaranteed inclusion when they're actually executed. And within that time delay, there's like some Oracle price that's, queried from a centralized exchange or like some other source. And the AMM then takes the trades at that centralized exchange price. So the first one is just like no more AMMs, like market makers rule the world. The second one is like, hey, if we really want to preserve AMMs, we want to like, democratize the profits from market making, not just, democratize the access, which is like kind of what the state of things is today. One way to do this is like give the informational advantage to these vaults. And one way to give the informational advantage is to delay the execution very briefly, wait for the Oracle price to be queried. And, if there's this delay, then the Oracle price ends up being fresher than the price of the people who are trading against it. So you would see like much less arbitrage volume happen on these AMMs, but you would see, you would also see that these like liquidity providers wouldn't be taking as many bad trades, and their liquidity would be reserved for people who are not adversely selecting, or at least like adversely selecting on like short time frames. Maybe they're running like mid to low frequency arbitrage, but they're not running like high frequency arbitrage and getting like basically no risk profits from the LPs. So I think that there's like a world of design to sort of explore there. I think what you give up in like Oracle-based mechanisms is price discovery. But I think like one of the things that I've also found like through exploring some of like the TradFi literature is that oracles are used in a lot of places. I know it's not LIBOR anymore, but I think like most desks and like strategies for the longest time used like the London interbank bid offer rate or something like that, or bank offer rate, something like this. Or I don't remember the exact word, but like, when they're basically giving out loans or taking out futures positions, they're kind of like using this like oracle in order to determine what like the risk-free rate is. And I think like, the oracles are like fine. I think like there's like a lot of this like anger towards oracles in crypto for no reason. I think it's just that like, poorly designed oracles are not fine. But like if an oracle is designed well, like, all power to you, like go and build great mechanisms around that. And I think like that's also part of like how we're thinking at Neutron is like, I don't know that as a decentralized blockchain will be able to compete on onboarding market makers versus like, some single sequencer L2. But I think we can compete on like, having this really credible oracle and giving information advantages to liquidity providers who could be anyone, right? Not just these like privileged people. And then I think like maybe one result that could be really exciting from this is that, the ability to crowdsource capital could end up like leading to deeper liquidity than, if you were relying on this like, small but talented set of operators. But yeah, I think it will probably exist.
That makes sense. I want to go back because I probe everybody on this. What do you think the future of long tail assets looks like? I'm always curious, and it sounds like a loaded question, and that's because it is. But the reason I'm asking is because I don't know exactly what that means. And a lot of times I think the pillar off of which AMM design is predicated is like, well, it gives the ability for the permissionless capital formation of long tail assets. And a lot of times I'm like, okay, so what are you talking about? Like IPOing on chain? Is this what, like, I never, like, I'm saying that now seriously, like, I don't really know what people mean when they say long tail assets, because as you know, most of the long tail assets we've seen and continue to see are absolute meme coin, shit coin. So I'm always curious, like, to get different people's opinions on like, what do you think long tail assets means in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're like roughly right. Like, I think they continue to be like, meme coins, shit coins, altcoins, whatever, that like maybe have like some small but like hopium percent probability that they like, will take off one day, like develop a community or like robust cash flows or like some monetary premium or something like this. Like, I think like that's roughly right. I do think like with the right AMM designs, you can probably cater towards, larger cap assets. In this like Oracle realm, you actually can only cater towards larger cap assets, right? Because the assumption of like running this like Oracle-like construction would be that, there's some Oracle that's reliable and is not manipulable. And so like this kind of assumes that there's like some deeper liquidity elsewhere where price discovery is happening, and that is like streaming a more reliable price feed than like what would exist on chain. So like, yeah, so this Oracle world is like, this Oracle world of AMMs will cater more towards like the large cap assets. I do agree with you though. Like, I don't really have a great answer to that. But yeah, I think it looks exactly like what you're saying. And yeah, people, I don't think like there's never going to be any other token that like kind of breaks out of this category though. So I think people will just like continue to be excited about it. So yeah, I like Toli's take about like the entertainment of it all. I mentioned earlier, before we were on this call, I mentioned I'm starting to play a little bit of poker, and I sports bet a little bit, but only the teams that I love. So like, I love the Knicks, so I'll sports bet a little bit on the Knicks when I'm watching the Knicks. And I'll do a similar thing with like NFTs and meme coins. Like I was never a huge NFT fan until I was gifted one or two NFTs that like ended up pumping in value. And like, now I kind of just like holding them. Like I kind of get it. I'm not going to sell them. I was gifted them by friends, and I'm like, oh, this is like kind of cool. Like I kind of get it. And there's like these group chats and you talk to people. It's like this social thing. It's just like another way of like gambling, I guess. And there's like obviously some chance that they like break out into cultural relevance or something like this. But yeah.
I think that I completely agree. And I'm fairly confident that meme coin is not going away anytime soon. And I agree that it's, satiating the desire for gambling speculation. I guess usually my reservations, or maybe the distinction I draw or attempt to draw, and you probably see this a lot in terms of how I troll, is that, there's a lot of times I think people assume that because something's useful for speculative, side note, this kind of goes to why I was asking what you think long tail assets mean. But a lot of times people assume that, well, this is good for spinning up, $5,000 market cap, pumped out fund coins. And this is good for, shitcoin with, or using like trading NFTs like that. Therefore it will ultimately become useful for global capital markets, right? And like putting capital to its highest and best use. And I'm like, this is just a leap, right? And we really haven't broken out of this chasm yet of, okay, it's all degeneracy to, well, this is the future of finance. And like a lot of times I look at this stuff and I'm sort of the opinion that it takes like, I'm trying to say this somewhat cautiously. It takes some like extreme confidence or like borderline mental gymnastics sometimes to say, oh, that's good for this. So it will be good for, global equities trading. It will be good for trading UST bills. It's like, bro, what are you talking about? Like, look at what people are doing and what they've done for the past 10 years. Like, you're making some pretty strong assumptions here. But like that was the impetus for the question, by the way. So you answered it well, though, and that was like entertainment value,
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with you. Like, I do think that it's probably like there's some non-zero chance, but very, very small that, we start seeing like new, like TradFi comes on chain and like the way that they come on chain is they start issuing assets on like pump.fund or something like this, like as like a bootstrapping mechanism. Like, I doubt like we'll see that. I doubt we'll see that, but, and I totally agree that there's like this leap of faith that generally people need to take in order to like, be willing to stay in this industry long enough to see this like credible compute vision through, like this, like how do we, approach like TradFi efficiency, but with like, cryptographic and like economic, credibility. But yeah, like I think the latter is like a more reasonable assumption, but the latter attached to the former of like, we're going to, not only are we going to get this like credible financial, these credible financial rails, but it'll also look exactly like a lot of this like speculative energy, probably not, but yeah.
I know you have thoughts on restaking. Let's hear them.
Yeah, that's like a can of worms.
Loaded. Yeah. I'm opening it. Run with it.
Okay. I like, so my original position on restaking for a long time was like, I don't really get it. But like I get that like Sriram and the Eigenlayer team are probably like really great distributed systems researchers and will build a lot of great systems on top of Eigenlayer. Like the reasons why I don't get it, and I've like written a few blog posts about this at this point, is like, restaking to me was never really about security. So like, think about like economic security for a second. And think about like, restaking an asset versus like launching a new asset. Low liquidity in a lot of ways is actually like an advantage because there's like, okay, let's take a step back. Actually, there's kind of two things that you're worried about if you're worried about economic security. Like you're worried about like either someone purchasing a ton of these tokens on the open market and then like taking over your quorum and like, manipulating the chain. Or you're worried about, someone, who's like already like an insider and they collude with a bunch of other insiders and they take over your chain. And like, in both cases, restaking is worse. Like restaking is worse for the, this kind of like buying on the open market very clearly because, if you're using this like larger cap asset, it's gonna be much cheaper to buy in size than if you like buy some like long tail asset. So like if you buy some long tail asset and you try to like go out and, let's say you have two chains with equal economic security, like $100 million of economic security, right? Buying $100 million of like Dogecoin, or maybe Doge is actually not the greatest example, but like buying $100 million of Neutron, let's say, you'll have a lot more slippage, there than you will on like, or a lot more price impact buying like, $100 million of Neutron on the open market versus like Ethereum. And so like the costs are actually higher to acquire the asset and then like take over the chain. The other form of like economic security, which you might be concerned about is like, okay, like, can existing operators collude? Can they get enough stake, to like, maliciously, behave? And, in this case, you also would prefer, having your own token than restaking. The reason for this is like, there's all these like sidelined operators, that exist in the Ethereum space. And, all it would take is like one of these sidelined operators. Realistically, if you're launching an APS, you're not going to get like 100% of the Ethereum stake. You might get like 1% of total Ethereum stake or like 3% of total Ethereum stake. Or like, let's say you even get 10% of Ethereum stake. well, there's like multiple coalitions of validators that exist today that would be able to like, if they entered that, into that position, they'd have a controlling stake right away. Not that they would do something, because obviously like there's like, security is much more nuanced than economic security, or like, like how many coalitions can be formed that can like take over the network. But like, yeah, in either cases, you probably want your own distribution, you want your own token. So like that kind of stood out to me as like, restaking was never about security. And then like, I kind of drew this conclusion, well, if it's not about security, why are people actually flocking towards this thing? And my original conclusion was like, oh, it's a licensing agreement. People are kind of like licensing the Ethereum brand or the EigenLayer brand or whatever. And this is like a good go-to-market for them because they basically buy the goodwill of the community. They're getting some of this, really premium brand, and that's, affecting their own personal brand. So that was kind of my direction for a bit. I also spent a little time looking into like LRTs. Because like there's like I feel like there's this joke floating around crypto Twitter for a long time, and after we talked about it, like you showed me some of your old tweets as well, so like you were one of the people making the jokes, but like just comparing like LRTs to like mortgage-backed securities, and yeah, I mean it turns out there's like some kind of interesting parallels to draw and look at, and especially just because like there's like these AVSs that are buying security or renting security. And they have like no income, no job, and what is it? No income, no job, and no I forget what
like neat.
No, it was like a ninja loan. So they used to call these like MBSs.
Oh yeah.
A lot of the loans that made up mortgage-backed securities were like loans to people with no income, no job, and no assets. So like, yeah, ninja, like no income, no job, no assets. And like a lot of these like ABSs that already have like billions of dollars of like capital committed to them, or maybe hundreds of millions, I'm not exactly sure, have no income, no job, no assets currently, or like no applications, whatever. And so yeah, so there's like kind of these like interesting parallels. Obviously they're not one-to-one, and like, I explored some of those in the blog post, like what's different, what's the same, what can we learn, what advantages does crypto maybe have? So it's not one-to-one. I think since then, like I've gotten excited about like two use cases for restaking though, that I would feel guilty to get on here and like, just bash restaking, especially because I have like a lot of respect for Sriram as like a person who is, putting himself out there and like trying to innovate in the space. I think like the two exciting things to me are like StakeSure, which is basically just like using the whatever is like staked as insurance if something goes wrong. And it's like a more capital efficient way to do insurance on like bridges. So like, let's say you have an Ethereum bridge and the Ethereum bridge gets corrupted and, someone takes control of it and starts double spending like crazy. Their stake gets slashed. And because it's like an Ethereum bridge, now that ETH that was like, staked to the bridge can be used as insurance to pay out, the losses. So I think like that's one interesting application that I actually think is like, has utility and like, would be beneficial for the space. And then the other thing that I think is like, I still have some hope for is like validator commitments. Like, can you build a system that, can, is like, positive sum for validators to opt into? And I think like specifically around like private order flow, like if you could build some system for private order flow and you only get access to this private order flow if you make a commitment, and like, your commitment gets slashed if you misbehave. And then like over time, people like opt in because, I just want more order flow. And as more people opt in, the user experience for the people submitting private transactions gets better. And then all of a sudden you have like, 50, 60, 70% of, the Ethereum stake, subjecting themselves to these additional, slashing conditions in order to get access to order flow, and users are benefiting because like now they have these like additional privacy guarantees. So I think like there's like some exciting things that could be done potentially around like validator commitments and positive sum games around that. But yeah, there's definitely also a lot of noise still. I mean, what do you think? What are you most excited about? What are you most scared about? What do you not care about?
I don't have a very strong, nothing that you probably can infer from a lot of what I tweet about. I mean, I guess to be determined. It's not something that like captivates me, I guess. I also think that if you So I think initially I viewed this more as like extreme rehypothecation. I think about it less like that now and more just, I think Tarun kind of talks about this. I don't really read in all of his papers, but just like like maybe it allows, additional yields that may sort of be hammered to the margin within like just a traditional validating set. And it can kind of like extend the viability of the premise of staking. I don't know. Like, I have probably different thoughts on how this plays out. I also think that these can be like sort of centralizing in the long run if there's like validators earning a lot of outsized yield for certain reasons versus other validators. And then you're kind of like become forced to opt into these, increasing layers of, like stake commitment. So I don't know. I'm not really the one to ask about this. It's not, it's funny to me. Let's put it that way. It's not something that I take like very, very seriously. So I'm not probably a good source here. Okay, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, what was kind of interesting to me is like when I first heard about restaking, I was like, okay, like, brilliant founder. Like, I can't really see this taking off. And what kind of really started getting me to care was like when I woke up one day and there was just like, tens of billions of dollars in, like these restaking protocols. And that was kind of like the interesting part for me was like, wait, like when this was explained to me previously, I didn't fully get it. I didn't think it was going to be this big, and now it's huge. So I need to understand why it's big. But
this is why, I guess maybe you kind of are articulating my point in a different sense. Like, all of this stuff is just seeking more and more yield. Like this is what it comes down to. Like that's why all these ABS have managed to capture all this, and then you can earn yield on your LRTs, and then you can earn yield on the yield on your LRTs. It's just like a cascading, like just debt positions. And there's nothing like that, I don't know. There's like a tremendous amount of viable economic activity coming out of this apart from just outsized, it's like seeking outsized yield. And I think that a lot of the core problem, I say problem, I don't know if there's a problem, but like what it comes down to is that when you have a validator set that is, being continuously added to, it compresses yields, and then people seek, alpha or whatever beyond that. And then we'll just see, like, we can see how long we can just like print tokens ad infinitum to satiate the thirst for yield. I don't know like where this really culminates. Maybe those two examples you gave are viable use cases. You hear like Tarun dig into like the most intricate mechanism aspects of this, and I'm like, bro, like obviously you have some skin in the game here if you care that much about the game theory of this. You know what I mean?
No comment.
Well, no, I mean, Tarun will know that I'll say this stuff, so it's not like he's going to be offended. It's just like, this is just this means absolutely nothing to me until anything comes of it, right? So that's why I didn't have anything to say, very, I didn't have anything profound to say there.
Interested in Bitcoin scaling, startups, or learning more about Bitcoin softworks? Join us Saturday, November 9th at the Fidelity Center in Boston, Massachusetts for Op Next, a one-day conference on scaling Bitcoin hosted by Blockspace Media, the producers of this podcast. Join Bitcoiners like Peter Todd, Portland Hodl, and more to discuss various Bitcoin proposals like OpCat, the Great Script Restoration, CTV, and more. Attend workshops, speaker sessions, and panels discussing the latest in scaling tech, from ZK to ARC to Bitcoin softwork history. And for a limited time, use code OCTOBER to get 25% off a general admission ticket. Find out more by visiting opnext.dev. Again, that's October at opnext.dev. You can find out more by checking out the show notes below.
Okay, let's talk. I guess you've been thinking more about the Ethereum and Bitcoin meta as of late. We can culminate with that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
Can of worms again. Sorry, can of worms. Not very articulate question. I usually just just start rambling, and I'll screech when I want to screech.
Yeah. I guess it goes back to like, what does Ethereum want to be, right? Like, I don't know if I don't know. My point earlier, I feel like is pretty close to it, where it's like, I think like Ethereum probably doesn't win as like the credible compute layer, like this like global financial system, at least on L1. And so it makes sense to preserve solo staking. It makes sense to, maximize decentralization. It makes sense to in the sense that you want this thing to be robust as possible, have as, strong liveness as possible. And yeah, you probably want to just fix your communication strategy a bit. I've spoken to Ekram, who's the CMO of Celestia a bunch of times, or maybe the head of marketing for Celestia. And the guy is brilliant, right? He obviously did a really amazing job with, the modular blockchain thesis and communicating that and figuring out how to puncture the sort of public consciousness with the super technical mission. And so I've learned a lot from things that he's talked about. One of the things that is apparent to me is there's a lot of frustration in Ethereum right now about how maybe it doesn't feel like what they're saying is resonating with users. And I think the reason for this, if I put my Ekram hat on, is that they for a long time they were kind of coasting on this narrative of the burn and ultrasound money, and a lot of the activity moving to L2 is not something that supports the burn or this ultrasound money thesis. And so they still want to sort of do this money thing, but they don't want it to be, ultrasound money, because that kind of conflicts with no activity or less activity happening on the L1. So they're trying to pivot to money, as in you can use Ethereum in a trust minimized way on L2s. But the community kind of hasn't figured out how to mobilize around this pivot in communication. And then I think the other thing is just I think there's another communications problem around layer twos. It's if you sit there and try to explain, 3 different crypto theses to your marginal investor, right? One, you try to explain Bitcoin and why it's going to be valuable as non-state money. 2, Solana and their thesis on building, on-chain finance. And then 3, Ethereum as this global settlement layer. I think you'll have the hardest time by far with the third. And I think in order to keep new entrants excited about it, one of 2 things needs to happen. Either layer 2s need to do that for Ethereum and need to figure out how to get people excited about ETH as the asset on layer 2s, or the Ethereum community very specifically just needs to figure out how to package what their goals and objectives are in a way that anyone in the world can kind of understand what's going on. And I think to really understand why Ethereum is the way it is today is not necessarily to, you're not necessarily going to arrive at this conclusion that this is a stupid place to arrive at. I think it's I understand the design decisions that they're making. I understand why they're making the design decisions. But I understand those things because I've kind of been around the space for some time now. And I talk to a lot of people who are working in Ethereum, and I understand the history of Ethereum. And I understand what a lot of the culture is about and what their objectives are. But it is an incredibly path dependent thing rooted in their history that newer users, newer entrants, newer builders, whatever it is, they're just going to have a much harder time syncing on that. And yeah, I think nailing the communications is probably something that would help with that. And I think it's really tough to do that in the Ethereum community right now. But yeah, I continue to be excited about Bitcoin. I continue to be excited about Solana. I continue to be excited about Ethereum in different ways. But I think Ethereum just has this communications problem right now. And I think it's kind of due to the fact that there was these 2 different lines of communications and thinking, one of which is complicated and very historically motivated, and the other which anyone could kind of understand and get behind, but is kind of disappearing as we make this transition into moving activity to the layer 2s. What do you think?
What do you think is, well, I was just going to follow up with what would be a straightforward line of communication then? How do you get people motivated then for this vision that at least you seem to be able to understand?
Yeah, I have no idea. I that's a full-time job. I don't know. I think probably something around I think it probably makes sense to keep going after money. I think there's certainly advantages to being able to use the asset cheaply on layer 2s, and in a way that you still get a lot of the guarantees of L1 security. I don't think your average person cares too much about that, but yeah, I think like leaning into that and thinking about how to communicate around that, about like why this is going to be like this really exciting asset that like has a lot more breadth at its disposal than maybe Bitcoin has right now or Solana has right now, and figuring out like how to simplify that messaging and communicate in a way that resonates with people. I think that's probably the best bet versus like trying to like communicate people like right away, like this like, kind of nuanced history and like, solo stakers and all of these different things. Like, yeah, probably not the strategy, but yeah, I guess like, Ethereum's greatest blessing is also its greatest curse in some ways, right? Like, I think it's very beautiful what they've kind of created. And like, this like, I do think there's like a lot of really well-intentioned people with a lot of very lofty and idealistic goals. And I have not really seen that in many other places on the internet. And like, I've never seen it at the scale and at the success that Ethereum has done it at. And so that's awesome and incredible. But also like this sort of thing has also revolved around a lot of properties that make it difficult to coordinate around like messaging and things like that. And so, yeah, I don't necessarily know that it's a solvable problem, but there's certainly like improvements that can be done. And yeah, like I said, like, I don't get paid to do that. So I've never thought about it too deep. I've just thought about it to the extent that I'm sharing. So I have no idea where they go from here, but that's my hunch.
Yeah, I think you're right. I also think that going after money is the clearest path to long-term value for ETH. Not necessarily value accrual, like in terms of fees and stuff. I don't know that I ascribe so much to that, but just in terms of like ETH, the money. I think it makes intuitive sense. I guess like maybe there's so much discourse about like, the sinking ship, and like I don't really think. Well, I think it's overblown. Obviously, I myself contribute to it, so I can't really say that. I'm over here like do as I say, not as I do. But like I just don't know. You talk about like all the idealism and like generating community around that. I guess like maybe if I had a more, I actually sent you a paper thing that I wrote and you like pushed back on it. But a lot of my thoughts are kind of, I think that a lot of the idealism and like lofty goals, like I don't really know that this is what users were ever there for. And I think that's kind of like the main argument that I can think of. And I also think that like the narratives in these, like this idealism that you see on Twitter, for example, like where a lot of us get like sort of our, brain rot, but where a lot of us see like kind of what's being pushed by these communities. Like, I think that Twitter self-selects for people who are likely very ideologically driven, and you make it like a 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 ratio of ideologues to people who are just sort of degenning and speculating and financially engineering whatever it is that they do on chain. So I think it can kind of like warp the understanding of what these systems are for. And so I think, I probably have stronger views on just like the ideology. Like I don't know that it is as real as people make it out to be. I just don't know. Like I don't know how many Ethereum users are actually like Sasano, right? Like I don't know how many Ethereum users like are truly there first and foremost for decentralization and credible neutrality and these like, sort of esoteric buzzwords. And I would probably point to the emergence of Solana as like viable competition as sort of evidence of precisely that. Like, would we see the level of activity and, sort of new entrants on Solana if it was indeed about, these like very idealistic, lofty kind of make the world a better place, better than anybody else type goals? I don't know.
Yeah, I would probably respond to that in a few ways. Like one, I'd say like, like I think certainly at the least, there's also like always going to be a lot of moral grandstanding. And that's like, it's impossible to discern like how much grandstanding anyone in particular is doing. I would say though that like, I think I agreed with everything you said pretty much. I think like the nuance that I would add though is like, while you're right that we don't know how many people are actually like this, there's certainly more people like that than most other places that at least I've seen. Definitely in crypto, probably the internet, or at least like the amount of following that this kind of stuff has, or this kind of thinking, or these kinds of people. So I think there's that, which is just like, whether or not, it's the dominant use case or not, it, relative to other ecosystems, other places on the internet, it does happen a lot. And it is kind of like motivating to see. Like I wouldn't, and I've always thought about like the people who work at the Ethereum Foundation in a lot of ways, like, and maybe this is like unraveling in different ways now, and it's not completely true and whatever, but my understanding is there's a lot of brilliant people who probably don't get paid as much as they could be getting paid in a lot of other jobs that they do. And I think that there is certainly this like relative level of like people feeling like they're missionaries more than their employees. And I think there's like pros and cons to this. But, to your point, do users actually want that? Does the mass market of users actually want that? And I think today, definitely not. In the long term, maybe there's some alignment with like, like the L2 roadmap and like, onboarding, I don't know, like more institutional capital, or like, like not necessarily institutional capital, like TradFi, but more so just like large holders who want like, self-custody, but like, you don't want TradFi efficiency, or want verifiable guarantees, but want TradFi efficiency or something like this. So like maybe there's like some long-term alignment with users, but I would agree that I think, I lean towards users don't want it as much as like the thought leaders want it. And that like that clash is like going to be unproductive for adoption, generally speaking. But, I also think it's like, okay, like, I don't think like credible neutrality. I think credible neutrality, like as a North Star, is like a valuable thing for someone to do. I think like Ethereum and like this obsession with credible neutrality, it's a valuable thing for something to do, for someone to do. It's not necessarily though like the most valuable North Star to have. It's not necessarily like the largest market per se, or something like this. And I think like, the sooner that people can come to terms with that, I think the better, because. At some point, like people will need to make a decision, or maybe they just never make a decision. Like this is just something that happens in perpetuity. But something can be valuable, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the largest cap asset in the world or the most valuable thing that's ever happened. You know what I mean? So
yeah, for sure. I guess the one this like coming full circle now. This is kind of why I press Max on. Okay, well, stablecoin. We can have the most efficient on-chain stablecoin markets. If you're going after optimizing spreads on stablecoins, like once again, does the level of credible neutrality make, it's like a huge difference? I'm not sure. It does. Like I guess I just don't have evidence to support a lot of these. Like I'm just like looking at this. I try to look at this fairly objectively, and I'm saying like I don't have evidence to support like that users are here for decentralization, that users are here for credible neutrality and like censorship resistance. Like it's like you said, it's near impossible to say that with any, high degree of conviction, but the evidence does not like suggest that to me. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the reality is like users are here for like this like messy blob of reasons. Everyone has their reason. I think some people are purely here for money. Some people are here because like, it's fucking amazing that you can create a bank account anywhere, being anyone in the world, in like less than a minute, onboard funds, and like start saving money. Or like maybe people are here, for those like ideals to build a more open internet and whatever. And like, there's not like any one reason why they're there. And yeah, I agree with you. Like if you want to build like, going back to like the original introduction, like, I was talking about how like, our position is that, we're, at Neutron is like, we're trying to make really opinionated infrastructure decisions, to like build for very specific use cases around like yield, exchange, and leverage. Like we don't think like credible neutrality is like the thing that will get us closer to that vision. We could be wrong. But yeah, I do agree with you. I have a feeling that like, there are other things that you should be optimizing for. if like you want to bring like, the world's like Forex markets on chain, or like, real world assets on chain, or even if you just want to bring like, Binance activity on chain, right? Like credible neutrality is like probably not the thing. And you don't necessarily need to be like the most credibly neutral place for like a blockchain to be, just because your blockchain is the most credibly neutral place doesn't mean that it's like not the most the most X thing for some other factor that matters, right? Like the most efficient, or like the most capital efficient, or like the fastest, or the cheapest, or whatever. And a lot of those things to a lot of different use cases matter more to users than credible neutrality. So yeah, I totally agree.
Awesome. Well, Elijah, thanks so much for coming on. That was fantastic. We covered a lot. So I do appreciate it. I'm glad I could be your first ever podcast.
Yeah, you'll always have that. You'll always be my first.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, dude. See ya.
Yeah, I'll see you.